What would you do if you witnessed your child being discriminated against right before your eyes? For Andrew Chen, CEO of one of America's largest airlines, that moment came on an ordinary flight to New York. But there was nothing ordinary about it. His 12-year-old daughter Emma didn't know he owned the airline. The flight attendant didn't know either. And what happened next would not only transform an entire company, but spark a movement that touched lives across the globe. This is a story about a father's love, a daughter's courage, and how one letter changed everything. Before this emotional story begins, leave a comment letting us know which city you're watching from, and don't forget to like, subscribe for good karma. Dawn was breaking over Manhattan as Andrew Chen stood at his office window, watching planes take off from JFK Airport in the distance. Each aircraft bore the distinctive blue and silver logo of Skybridge Airways, the airline he had built from the ground up over the past 15 years. At 45, Andrew had become the first Asian American CEO to own a major U.S. airline, though very few people knew this fact. Unlike most corporate leaders who sought the spotlight, Andrew had chosen a different path. His office had no photographs on the walls, no awards on display, and most importantly, no indication that he owned the company. There was a reason for this carefully maintained anonymity. His 12-year-old daughter, Emma. "Your childhood should be yours, not defined by who your father is," he had told Emma years ago. It was a promise he'd made to his late wife, Sarah, before cancer took her when Emma was just 4. Sarah had been a public school teacher who believed in raising their daughter with normal, grounded experiences. Andrew honored that wish every day. In the soft morning light, he pulled out his worn leather wallet and looked at the photo tucked inside, Emma and Sarah at the beach, both laughing as waves crashed behind them. 8 years had passed, but Andrew still ran his company with Sarah's values in mind. Treat everyone with kindness, stay humble, and remember that success means nothing without family. Emma had grown into a remarkable young girl. Like her mother, she loved reading and had an innate sense of justice. She attended public school, rode the bus like other kids, and had no idea that the planes she often watched from their apartment window belonged to her father. To her, Andrew was simply Dad, the one who made slightly burnt pancakes on Sundays and never missed her school performances, even if it meant rescheduling board meetings. Only a handful of trusted executives knew that the mysterious owner of Skybridge Airways lived such a private life. To the rest of the world, Andrew Chen was listed as a senior vice president, just another name in the corporate hierarchy. This arrangement had worked perfectly for years, allowing Emma to grow up away from the pressure and scrutiny that came with being a CEO's daughter. But now, everything was about to change. That morning's copy of Business Weekly sat on his desk, and the headline made his heart sink. "The Silent Tiger, Asian Billionaire Behind Skybridge Airways." The article was scheduled to run next week, and for the first time in 12 years, Andrew's carefully constructed privacy was about to shatter. He picked up his phone and dialed a familiar number. "Emma? How would you like to skip school tomorrow and take a trip to New York with your old dad?" Her excited squeal brought a smile to his face, but his heart was heavy. This would be their last flight as anonymous passengers, their final journey before the world knew who they really were. What Andrew didn't know was that this flight would change not just their lives, but the entire airline industry in ways he could never have imagined. The next morning, Andrew watched Emma pack her favorite manga books into her backpack, her excitement palpable as she bounced around their apartment. She had inherited her mother's Asian features, but had Sarah's free spirit, a combination that filled him with both joy and a fierce need to protect her. "Dad, why the sudden trip?" Emma asked, tucking a strand of dark hair behind her ear. "Not that I'm complaining about missing Ms. Peterson's math test." Andrew sat on the edge of her bed, picking up the worn copy of The Tale of the Bamboo Cutter, the last book Sarah had given Emma. How do you tell your child that her world is about to change? Remember how we always talk about what makes a person special, Emma? He began carefully. About how it's not what they own or their job title, but who they are inside. Emma nodded, her bright eyes curious. Like how Mom always said, true character shows in how you treat others, not what you have. Exactly. Andrew took a deep breath. Sweetheart, there's something about our family that's going to become public soon. A magazine is running a story about my work, about Skybridge Airways. Emma's brow furrowed. But you're just a vice president, Dad. Why would they? That's not exactly true, Andrew said softly. I actually own Skybridge Airways. I'm the CEO. I've kept it private all these years because I wanted you to have a normal childhood like Mom wanted. The silence that followed felt endless. Emma's hands stopped midway through packing, her manga forgotten. All those planes, they're yours? Ours, she whispered. They're part of our family's story, yes. But I never wanted that to define who you are. Andrew moved closer, taking her small hands in his. Next week everyone will know. That's why I wanted us to take this trip together. One last adventure as just us, before things change. Emma sat quietly, processing. Then, with wisdom beyond her years, she asked, Is that why you always fly economy with me? Why we stand in regular lines? Andrew nodded, his throat tight. Your mother believed that privilege shouldn't change how we treat people or experience life. I wanted you to learn that too. Standing at their apartment window, Emma watched a Skybridge plane soar overhead, its wings catching the morning sun. Will people treat us differently now? Some might, Andrew admitted. That's why this trip is special. It's probably our last chance to be just another father and daughter on a flight, experiencing things the way we always have. As they headed to the airport, Andrew held Emma close and whispered, This might be our last flight as ordinary people, sweetheart. But remember, being ordinary or extraordinary isn't about what we own. It's about how we treat others along the way. Little did they know, this philosophy would be tested sooner than either expected on a flight that would challenge their values and change countless lives. The morning flight to New York was half full, a typical Tuesday service. Andrew and Emma settled into their economy seats, 14A and 14B, just like any other passengers. Emma pulled out her manga, Your Name, while Andrew pretended to be absorbed in his newspaper, though his eyes kept drifting to the Skybridge Airways logo on the flight attendants' uniforms. Victoria Martinez had been a flight attendant for 20 years. As head flight attendant, she prided herself on running a tight ship. Her perfectly pressed uniform and severe bun reflected her no-nonsense approach. When she noticed the Asian father and daughter in row 14, her lips tightened almost imperceptibly. "Excuse me," Victoria's voice cut through the cabin as she approached Emma. "We're about to take off. That Chinese comic book needs to go in the overhead compartment." "It's actually Japanese manga," Emma began politely, "and the seatbelt sign isn't on ye." Before she could finish, Victoria snatched the book from her hands. "These foreign books with their backward reading. Store it properly or I'll have to confiscate it." Andrew's hands gripped his armrests, his knuckles turning white. He'd faced subtle discrimination throughout his career, but watching it directed at his daughter was different. Still, years of maintaining his cover made him hesitate. "Ma'am," he said quietly, his CEO voice carefully contained. "My daughter was reading quietly. The flight hasn't begun boarding yet, and there's no safety issue." Victoria's response dripped with condescension. "Sir, if you can't understand our American aviation rules, perhaps you should have chosen a different airline. We do things properly here." Emma watched her father's face, seeing the muscle in his jaw tighten, the same way it did when he talked about missing her mother. She'd never seen that look of helpless anger in his eyes before. "Dad," she whispered, touching his arm. "It's okay. I have another book." But it wasn't okay. Emma saw something shift in her father's expression. Not just pain, but determination. She remembered his words about character showing through how you treat others. Right now, watching Victoria walk away with her manga, Emma understood what he meant in a way no lesson could have taught her. An elderly passenger across the aisle leaned over. "I couldn't help overhearing," she said kindly. "I'm reading a lovely novel if you'd like to borrow it, dear." Emma smiled politely, but shook her head. She pulled out her notebook instead and began to write. If her father had taught her anything, it was that words had power when used with purpose and compassion. Andrew watched his daughter writing, his heart a mix of pride and ache. He could have revealed his identity, could have called Victoria's supervisor with a single word. But as Emma's pen moved across the page, he realized that sometimes the quietest responses could be the most powerful. "What are you writing?" he asked softly. Emma looked up, her mother's determination shining in her eyes. "A letter, Dad. Not just about the manga, but about something bigger. About how we treat people when we think we know their story." Outside their window, the morning sun caught the Skybridge Airways wing, casting a golden glow through the cabin. Neither Andrew nor Emma knew it yet, but that moment, that letter, would spark a change far beyond one flight attendant's prejudice or one airline's policies. It would remind the world that the most important journeys aren't about reaching destinations, but about how we treat each other along the way. That evening, in their Manhattan hotel room, Emma couldn't sleep. The incident on the plane kept replaying in her mind. While her father was taking a shower, she opened her laptop, a birthday gift from him, and typed "Asian CEOs in America" into the search bar. What she found made her stomach clench. Comment after comment, article after article revealed an ugly truth she'd been sheltered from. These foreigners taking American jobs. They're buying up our companies. Can't trust them to be real leaders. Some comments were specifically about Skybridge Airways' mysterious Asian owner, her father. The bathroom door opened and Emma quickly closed the laptop. But Andrew saw the tears she was trying to hide. "Can't sleep?" he asked, sitting on the edge of her bed. The city lights twinkled through their window, casting soft shadows across the room. "Dad," Emma's voice wavered, "how long have people been saying these things about you?" "About us?" Andrew's expression shifted as he realized what she'd discovered. He was quiet for a moment, gathering his thoughts. "Remember that story Mum used to tell you about the bamboo tree?" Emma nodded. "How it grows underground for years before anyone sees it." "Yes." She used to say that strength grows the same way, quietly, deeply, where no one can see it. He took Emma's hand. "I've dealt with prejudice my whole life, sweetheart. When I started Skybridge, many people didn't believe an Asian immigrant could run an American airline. But your mother taught me something important. People's words can only define you if you let them. Is that why you kept it a secret? To protect me?" "Partly," Andrew admitted, "but also because your mother and I wanted you to form your own identity, to be judged by your character, not your background or your father's position." Emma was quiet for a long moment, playing with the corner of her notebook. "Today on the plane, when Ms. Martinez took my manga, I saw your face, Dad. You wanted to tell her who you were, didn't you?" "I did," he said softly. "But sometimes the strongest response isn't about showing power, it's about showing character." Emma opened her notebook, where she'd started her letter. "I've been thinking, This isn't just about my manga or one flight attendant, is it? It's about everyone who's ever felt small because of who they are. Andrew looked at his daughter's determined expression, so much like Sarah's, and felt a profound mix of pride and sadness. His little girl was growing up, facing the world's harsh realities, but choosing to respond with wisdom beyond her years. "What does your heart tell you to write?" he asked. Emma's pen hovered over the page. "I want to write about today, but not to get anyone in trouble. I want to write about how it feels when people decide who you are before knowing you, about how everyone deserves to be treated with respect, no matter where they're from or what they look like." She looked up at her father. "Mum always said that words can build bridges or walls. I want my words to build bridges, Dad." Andrew felt tears prick his eyes. Sarah would have been so proud of their daughter in this moment. "Then write from your heart, Emma. Sometimes the most powerful words come from the quietest voices." As Andrew tucked her in later that night, Emma was still writing. The city that never sleeps hummed below their window, but in their room there was only the soft sound of pen on paper and the quiet determination of a young girl finding her voice. What emerged wasn't just a complaint about one incident. It was becoming a letter about dignity, respect, and the simple truth that humanity shouldn't be determined by appearance or assumptions. Emma wrote late into the night, pouring out words that would soon touch hearts across the country. The next morning, Andrew took Emma to the Civil Rights exhibition at the Metropolitan Museum. While the incident from yesterday still weighed heavily on their minds, he believed it was important for Emma to understand the larger context of their experience. What neither of them expected was meeting Grace Washington. They found her in the photography section, studying a black and white image of the 1963 March on Washington. At 82, Grace stood tall and dignified, her silver hair crowned with a purple hat that matched her elegant dress. She noticed Emma staring at the same photograph. "That was a day when words changed the world," Grace said, her voice warm and rich with memory. "I was just 17 standing there in that crowd, listening to Dr. King's Dream." Emma moved closer, drawn by the gentle power in Grace's voice. "You were really there?" Grace's eyes sparkled. "I was. And let me tell you something, child. I see that same look in your eyes that I had back then. The look that says you've got something important to say." Andrew watched as his daughter pulled out her notebook, the letter she'd been working on visible through the pages. Grace noticed it too. "Writing something important?" she asked. Emma hesitated, then spoke softly. "Yesterday something happened on our flight. Someone treated us differently because of how we look." She glanced at her father. "I'm trying to write about it, but I'm not sure if it will make any difference." Grace settled onto a nearby bench, patting the space beside her. "Come, sit with me a moment, both of you." As they sat, she continued, "You know what the most powerful weapon we had during the civil rights movement? It wasn't anger, though we had plenty to be angry about. It was dignity. Words written with dignity have a way of opening hearts that shouting never can." She pointed to another photograph, this one of young children participating in peaceful protests. These children changed minds not by matching hate with hate, but by showing the world their humanity. Sometimes the strongest response to prejudice is to hold up a mirror and let people see their own actions clearly. Emma opened her notebook. "That's what I want to do with my letter. Not just complain, but help people understand how it feels, how one person's actions can affect someone's whole world." Grace nodded approvingly. "May I?" she asked, holding out her hand for the notebook. As she read Emma's words, her expression softened. When she finished, she turned to Emma with tears in her eyes. "Child, this letter. It's not just about one incident on a plane. It's about human dignity, about seeing each person's worth. She reached into her purse and pulled out a small, worn book. This was my journal from 1963. I want you to have it. Emma's eyes widened. Oh, I couldn't. Yes, you can, Grace insisted gently, because you understand something many people never learn. That change doesn't always come from grand gestures. Sometimes it comes from one person saying, "This is how it feels. This is why it matters." Andrew watched as Grace and Emma bent over the notebook together, the elderly civil rights veteran and the young Asian American girl, separated by decades, but united in purpose. Grace helped Emma refine her words, not by changing their meaning, but by strengthening their impact. "Remember," Grace said as they prepared to leave, "your words aren't just for that flight attendant. They're for everyone who needs to be reminded that humanity comes in all colors, all ages, all backgrounds, right from that place of truth." That afternoon, back in their hotel room, Emma rewrote her letter one final time. Now it wasn't just her voice on the page. It carried echoes of Grace's wisdom, her mother's compassion, and her father's quiet strength. "Dad," she said, looking up from the finished letter, "I think it's ready." Andrew read the letter, feeling the power of its simple truth. His daughter had written something that went beyond complaint or criticism. She had written about hope, about the possibility of change, about the world as it could be. As the sun set over Manhattan, Emma carefully folded the letter, slipping Grace's journal bookmark between its pages. Tomorrow they would fly home, and this letter would begin its own journey, one that would touch far more lives than either of them could imagine. Emma's letter arrived at Skybridge Airways corporate headquarters on a Tuesday morning, one of hundreds of customer feedback messages. But by Wednesday afternoon, it had brought the entire executive floor to a standstill. "Sir," Andrew's assistant, Michael, rushed into his office. "The letter, it's gone viral. Someone in customer relations shared it on LinkedIn, and now it's everywhere." Andrew looked up from his computer, where he'd been watching the numbers climb. Over 100,000 shares in just hours. Skybridge shame was trending on Twitter. Major news networks were calling for comments. The letter read, in part, "Dear Skybridge Airways, I am 12 years old, and yesterday I learned what it feels like to be judged by my face instead of my heart. Your flight attendant didn't just take away my manga book, she took away my dignity. But this letter isn't about revenge. It's about hope." When she looked at my father and me, she saw foreigners who didn't belong. She didn't see that my dad reads me Shakespeare before bed, or that my late mum was a teacher who believed in the American dream. She didn't know that the manga she grabbed was a gift from my mum before she passed away. But here's what hurts most. How many others have felt small on your planes? How many have swallowed their pain and stayed silent? My father taught me that character shows in how we treat others. Today, I'm choosing to speak not just for myself, but for everyone who has ever been made to feel they don't belong in the skies you claim to serve. The letter went on to describe the incident with grace and clarity that belied the writer's age. It never named Victoria Martinez, but its description of the event was compelling enough that several passengers had come forward confirming the account. In the midst of the growing storm, Victoria Martinez sat in HR, her hands trembling as she read the online comments calling for her termination. 20 years of service, reduced to one horrible moment of prejudice. "Mr. Chen," Michael interrupted again, "Ms. Martinez is asking to speak with senior management, and CNN is running the story at 6. Andrew closed his eyes, remembering Emma's words the night she wrote the letter. Sometimes the strongest response isn't about showing power, it's about showing character. He picked up his phone. "Schedule an all-hands meeting, every employee, every level, 2 hours from now." The company auditorium was packed. Victoria sat in the front row, her usual confident posture replaced by a visible weight of shame. Whispers rippled through the crowd as Andrew walked to the podium, not taking his usual place among the VPs, but stepping up to the main microphone. "Good afternoon," he began. "Most of you know me as Andy Chen from Strategic Planning. Today, I need to introduce myself properly." He paused, looking directly at Victoria. "I am Andrew Chen, CEO and owner of Skybridge Airways, and the 12-year-old girl who wrote that viral letter about experiencing discrimination on our flight, she is my daughter." The auditorium erupted in gasps. Victoria's face drained of colour as the full reality hit her. She had treated the owner's daughter with prejudice, the very man who signed her paychecks. "But that's not why I'm here," Andrew continued, his voice steady. "I'm here because my daughter's letter asks us a crucial question. Who do we want to be as a company, as human beings?" He stepped away from the podium, walking closer to his employees. The easy response would be to fire Ms. Martinez, to make this about one person, one incident. But my daughter's letter speaks to something deeper. It speaks to a culture that needs to change, not through punishment, but through transformation. Victoria stood up, tears streaming down her face. "Sir, I should resign." "No, Ms. Martinez. That's not the answer." Andrew's voice was firm but compassionate. "My daughter wrote about hope, about believing people can change. So I'm offering you a choice. You can leave Skybridge, or you can help us become better." The silence in the auditorium was absolute. "I'm announcing today the creation of the Cultural Bridge Initiative. We're going to transform our training, our policies, and our corporate culture. Ms. Martinez, if you're willing, I want you to be part of this transformation, to help us understand how biases can blind us and how we can do better." Victoria's hands covered her mouth, tears flowing freely now. "After what I did, you'd give me that chance." "My late wife believed that education was the bridge between ignorance and understanding," Andrew said softly. "My daughter believes in the power of second chances. What do you believe, Ms. Martinez?" Victoria straightened her shoulders, wiping her tears. I believe I have a lot to learn, and even more to teach others about my mistakes." As the meeting concluded, Andrew knew this was just the beginning. His phone was already buzzing with media requests and board member concerns. But looking at Victoria's face, seeing the genuine remorse and determination there, he knew Emma's letter had sparked exactly the kind of change she'd hoped for. Not revenge, not punishment, but transformation. 3 months after Emma's letter went viral, Skybridge Airways' main training centre had been transformed. The once sterile corporate space now showcased a vibrant mural spanning its entrance, a bridge made of intertwined hands of different colours reaching across the sky. Victoria Martinez stood before her first class of flight attendants, her hands slightly trembling. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The woman whose actions had sparked a controversy was now leading cultural sensitivity training. But that was exactly why her words carried such weight. "My name is Victoria Martinez," she began, her voice steady despite her nerves. "And 3 months ago, I made a mistake that taught me the hardest lesson of my 20-year career." The room was filled with both new recruits and veteran staff, all part of Skybridge's ambitious Cultural Bridge initiative. Among them sat May Chen, a senior flight attendant from San Francisco, and James Williams, an African-American pilot with 30 years of experience. They were part of the program's advisory board, chosen to help shape its direction. "I thought I knew what good service meant," Victoria continued, playing the now famous video of Emma's story, which had been viewed millions of times. "I thought it was about rules, procedures, and maintaining order. But I'd forgotten the most important thing, seeing the humanity in every passenger. The training program wasn't just about avoiding discrimination, it was about understanding the rich tapestry of cultures that their passengers represented. Each session began with employees sharing their own stories of identity and belonging. May stood up, her voice gentle but firm. When my family first came to America, we barely spoke English. Every flight was terrifying, not because of flying, but because of feeling lost, different. Now, when I see Asian families boarding with that same nervous look, I make sure they know they're not alone. James shared next. Last month, I had a young black boy peek into the cockpit. His eyes got so wide seeing someone who looked like him in the captain's seat. That's why representation matters. That's why this program matters. Victoria listened to each story with tears in her eyes, taking notes. Her own journey from prejudice to understanding had become a powerful teaching tool. The shame she'd felt reading Emma's letter had transformed into a fierce determination to make amends through action. During breaks, employees gathered around cultural exchange stations where they could learn basic greetings in different languages, understand cultural customs, and even experience traditional foods. The sterile training manual had been replaced with real human connections. The key, Victoria explained, is understanding that diversity isn't about tolerance, it's about celebration. Each passenger brings their own story, their own traditions, their own way of seeing the world. Our job is to make everyone feel at home in the skies. Andrew often stopped by these sessions, usually standing quietly in the back. Today he watched as Victoria led a role-playing exercise about handling cultural misunderstandings. Her transformation was remarkable, from someone who had acted out of bias to someone who helped others recognize and overcome their own prejudices. Ms. Martinez, a young flight attendant, raised her hand. How do you deal with the shame? Not just about that incident, but when you realize you've had these biases all along. Victoria paused, considering. Shame can either break you or transform you. I choose transformation. Every day I read Emma's letter again, not to punish myself, but to remind myself why this work matters. The afternoon session brought a surprise visitor, Grace Washington herself, her purple hat bright against the corporate backdrop. She had become a regular speaker, bridging her civil rights experience with contemporary challenges. Change, Grace told the group, is like that bridge in your beautiful mural. It's built one hand at a time, one story at a time, one heart at a time. As the day's session ended, Victoria found herself looking at a new message on her phone, from Emma. The two had begun corresponding after Andrew suggested it might help them both heal. Dear Ms. Martinez, it read, Dad showed me the training video. You're turning a moment of pain into a lifetime of change. That's what courage looks like. Victoria touched the screen gently, remembering the scared, angry person she'd been just months ago. The Cultural Bridge Initiative hadn't just changed Skybridge Airways, it had changed her. Every day she heard new stories, learned new perspectives, and saw the world through different eyes. Outside the training center, the setting sun caught the mural's colors, making the intertwined hands glow. Victoria smiled, thinking of Emma's words in her letter. True belonging isn't about where you're from, but how you make others feel when they're with you. Emma stood before her middle school assembly, her heart pounding but her voice clear. The auditorium was packed, not just with students, but with local media and education officials. Her story had sparked a district-wide conversation about inclusion in schools. 6 months ago, she began, I was just a girl who loved manga and missed her mum. Today, I stand here because one difficult moment taught me that our voices matter, especially when speaking up feels scary. In the back of the auditorium, Andrew watched his daughter with tears in his eyes. Next to him sat Grace Washington, beaming with pride, and a group of students from Emma's newly formed Cultural Voices Club, a rainbow of faces representing the school's diversity. My father taught me that success isn't about what you own, Emma continued, glancing at Andrew. "It's about how you make others feel. My mother believed that education was the bridge to understanding. And my friend Grace showed me that change starts with one brave voice." The screen behind her displayed photos from Skybridge's Cultural Bridge Initiative. Victoria teaching a class, flight attendants learning traditional greetings in different languages, children from various backgrounds visiting the cockpit. But it was the newest project that had everyone buzzing. Voices of Change, a podcast created by Emma and her multicultural group of friends. "When we started the podcast," Emma explained, "we thought we'd just share our stories. But something magical happened. People started sharing back." She played a clip from their latest episode. A Korean grandmother's voice filled the auditorium, sharing how a Skybridge flight attendant had helped her feel welcome on her first flight to America. Then a Middle Eastern student described how the airline's new prayer room made him feel respected. Each story built upon the last, creating a tapestry of voices too powerful to ignore. "These aren't just stories," Emma said, her voice growing stronger. "They're bridges between hearts. Every time we listen to someone's story, we build another bridge." In the front row, Emma's best friends, Jasmine, Miguel, and Sarah, nodded encouragingly. They had become her podcast co-hosts, each bringing their own cultural perspectives and experiences to the conversation. "Our podcast now reaches thousands of listeners," Emma continued, "but more importantly, it's teaching us that every voice matters. The quiet kid in class who feels different, the new student still learning English, the grandmother carrying traditions across oceans, they all have stories that deserve to be heard." Andrew watched as his daughter handled the Q&A session with poise and authenticity. When a young Asian student asked how to deal with bullying, Emma's response brought tears to many eyes. "Remember this," she said gently. "Your identity is not your limitation. It's your superpower. My Asian heritage, my father's journey, my mother's memory, they don't make me less American. They make my American story richer." After the assembly, as students crowded around Emma to share their own stories, Andrew felt a hand on his shoulder. It was Grace. "She's her mother's daughter," Grace said softly. "Sarah would be so proud." "She's more than that," Andrew replied, watching Emma hug a tearful student. "She's become her own person, braver than I ever was at her age." That evening in their apartment, Emma was editing the next podcast episode when Andrew brought her favorite tea, the jasmine blend her mother had loved. "Dad," she said, looking up from her computer, "do you think we're really making a difference? Not just with Skybridge, but with everything." Andrew sat beside her, noticing how much she'd grown in these past months. "Remember what that student said today? Your podcast made me feel less alone. That's what change looks like, sweetheart. One heart at a time." Emma leaned against her father's shoulder, both of them looking out at the city lights. Below, they could see the Skybridge office building, its windows glowing warmly in the dusk. "Mum would have loved the podcast," Emma said softly. "She would have been the first subscriber," Andrew smiled. "But you know what she would have loved even more? Seeing how you've turned pain into purpose, how you're helping others find their voice." Emma picked up Grace's journal, her constant inspiration, and opened to a bookmarked page. "Grace wrote something here that I read before every podcast. Change isn't about being the loudest voice. It's about being the voice that helps others find their courage to speak." As they sat together, father and daughter, the city hummed with stories waiting to be told. Emma's laptop showed hundreds of new messages from podcast listeners, each one a testament to the power of a single voice multiplied by courage and compassion. The United Nations Assembly Hall hummed with anticipation. On stage, Emma Chen, now 13, adjusted her microphone. The audience before her included world leaders, corporate executives, and hundreds of young activists. Above her, the UN screens displayed Skybridge Airways' new slogan, "Every story has wings." "A year ago," Emma began, "a flight attendant took away my manga book because it was foreign. Today, that same flight attendant, Ms. Victoria Martinez, runs cultural sensitivity training for one of America's largest airlines. This is not just a story about change, it's proof that transformation is possible when we choose understanding over anger and education over exclusion." In the front row, Victoria sat beside Grace Washington, both women wiping tears. Behind them, Andrew watched his daughter with quiet pride. Skybridge Airways had become more than an airline. It was now a case study in corporate transformation. "Last month," Emma continued, "Skybridge celebrated its millionth passenger in our new Cultural Bridge program. Our planes now have prayer rooms, multilingual staff, and menu options from around the world. But the real change isn't in our services. It's in our hearts." The next morning, the Forbes magazine photographer captured Andrew and Emma in a candid moment. They were standing in Skybridge's new scholarship centre, where hundreds of applications from minority students lined the walls. The headline would read, "How a Father, a Daughter, and a Letter Revolutionized American Aviation." Andrew explained to the reporter, "The Skybridge Cultural Scholarship Fund will send 1,000 students to college this year. But more importantly, it will give them internships, mentoring, and a chance to shape the future of aviation." Emma added, showing the reporter her podcast studio, "Every scholarship recipient shares their story on Voices of Change. We've had students from 40 different countries tell their stories. Next month, we're launching in 10 new languages." The interview was interrupted by a surprise visitor, Victoria Martinez, carrying a familiar manga book. "I think it's time to return this," she said softly, handing Emma her copy of Your Name. "I keep a photo of it in our training center to remind everyone where our journey began." Emma hugged Victoria, a gesture that would have seemed impossible a year ago. "It's not about the book anymore," Emma said. "It's about what it taught us." Grace Washington, who had become Skybridge's honorary board member, joined them. Her purple hat was now a familiar sight in their corporate headquarters. "You know what makes this story special?" she asked the reporter. "It's not just about diversity and inclusion, it's about the power of forgiveness to create real change." Andrew watched as Emma showed the reporter her latest project, a children's book series about cultural understanding, illustrated with characters from around the world. The first book, The Letter That Flew, was already in its third printing. That evening, in their apartment, Emma and Andrew sat in their favourite spot by the window. Below them, a Skybridge plane took off, its lights twinkling against the darkening sky. "Dad," Emma said, holding her mother's photo, "do you think we made the change Mum would have wanted to see?" Andrew pulled his daughter close. "Your mother believed that education could build bridges between hearts. You've built bridges across the whole sky, sweetheart." The city lights sparkled below as father and daughter sat in comfortable silence. On Emma's desk lay a letter from the UN Youth Council, inviting her to lead their global initiative on cultural understanding. Next to it was Grace's journal, Victoria's training manual, and a new manga book, this one written by Emma herself, telling the story of a girl who discovered that the greatest journeys aren't about the distance travelled, but the hearts transformed along the way. "You know what Mum used to say," Emma smiled, watching another Skybridge plane soar past their window. "Every story matters because every heart matters." Andrew nodded, his heart full. Together, they had turned a moment of pain into a movement of change. And somewhere he knew Sarah was smiling down on their own bridge across the sky. Thank you for taking time to witness this story with us. If this story touched your heart, share your thoughts in the comments. Every story we share is meant to move and transform. If you found inspiration in today's tale, simply leave a 9 below. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that remind us of our shared humanity. Until our next story unfolds.